Sergeant Marcus Cole raised his hand, and 40 hidden fighters along the ridge went, still waiting for his signal to slaughter the 7 Americans walking straight into his trap. He smiled. He had studied their patrol pattern for 11 days. He knew exactly where they would stop, exactly where they would be trapped. Between rock walls with no escape, and in less than 3 minutes, 7 families back in the United States would receive a knock on the door they would never recover from. Before you watch what Marcus Cole was about to do to those soldiers, subscribe to this channel, follow the story to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning of the night that would change everything. Nobody in the valley knew her real name anymore. To the enemy fighters who had heard stories passed down through radio chatter and whispered warnings, she was a ghost, a legend, a name meant to frighten new recruits into staying alert on watch. Shadow Viper. But on this particular night, 3 years after she swore she would never touch a rifle in combat again, Captain Emily Carter was nothing more than a woman lying flat against frozen rock. Breathing slowly, watching a valley she had promised herself she would never enter again. Her hands were steady. They always were. That was the cruel joke of it all. Her hands never shook, not even now, not even after everything. It was her mind that shook. It was her heart that had been shattered into pieces 3 years ago and never quite put back together, no matter how many nights she spent alone trying to convince herself she was healed. She adjusted the focus on her scope and scanned the compound below. 7 American operators were moving in formation through the snow, weapons raised, eyes sharp, boots silent against the frozen ground. She recognized the movement patterns immediately. Navy SEALs, elite, trained to perfection, and completely unaware of what was waiting for them. "Command, this is Overwatch radio check," she whispered into her headset. "Overwatch, we read you, go ahead," a voice answered. "I'm in position. I have eyes on the compound. Nothing seems out of place yet." Emily paused, scanning left then right. "Confirm my role tonight is intelligence support only." "Confirm, Captain. Observation and reporting only. No engagement." "Understood." She repeated those words to herself. No engagement. She had said yes to this mission for one reason and one reason only. Because Commander Ryan Mitchell, a man she had trained personally, a man she respected more than almost anyone left in the service, had asked her directly. He hadn't ordered her. He had asked her, man to woman, soldier to soldier, because he knew what she had been through, and he knew he had no right to force her back into that world. "I need your eyes tonight, Emily," he had told her 3 days earlier, standing in a briefing room lit by cheap fluorescent lights. "Nobody reads terrain like you do. Nobody sees what's coming before it happens like you do. I'm not asking you to fire a single round. I just need you to watch our backs from a distance." She had wanted to say no. Every instinct in her body had screamed at her to say no. But then he had shown her photographs. 3 American aid workers, a husband and a wife, and their 19-year-old daughter captured 6 days earlier while delivering medical supplies to a mountain village. The daughter's name was Sarah. Sarah had a birthday in 4 days. If nothing was done, there was a strong chance Sarah would never see it. Emily had stared at that photograph for a long time. "Fine," she had finally said, "but I watch. I don't shoot. I'm done with that part of my life." Mitchell had nodded slowly, understanding more than he said out loud. "Understood, Captain, and you watch. We do the rest." Now lying in the snow with frost clinging to her eyelashes, Emily kept that promise fresh in her mind. Watch only, don't engage. Don't become her again. Don't become the woman who pulled a trigger and lost the only person who had ever truly trusted her. She closed her eyes for half a second, and the memory came anyway, uninvited, the way it always did. Syria, 18 months before she left active combat. A rooftop. A spotter beside her calling out wind speed and distance with the calm professionalism of a man who had done this 100 times before. Sergeant Michael Reynolds, her best friend, her partner. The man who used to joke that if either of them ever died on a mission, the other one had to name their next dog after them. "Wind's shifting, Miriam," Michael had said that night. "Give it 2 more seconds before you take the shot." She hadn't listened. She had taken the shot early. And the building had come down wrong. Not because of her shot, because of something no one could have predicted, a secondary explosive rigged by the enemy specifically to punish anyone who dared take that exact position. But it didn't matter what investigators later concluded. It didn't matter that they ruled it an unavoidable tragedy. In Emily's mind and the part of her soul that refused to forgive itself, she had taken that shot 2 seconds too early, and 2 seconds had cost Michael his life. She opened her eyes, the memory dissolved back into the darkness where it lived, and the valley below came back into focus. Something was wrong. She noticed it immediately, the way a person notices a single wrong note in an otherwise perfect song. The compound guards were too relaxed. Two of them were sitting by a fire, weapons resting against their knees instead of in their hands. A third was walking in slow, careless circles instead of maintaining a proper perimeter sweep. "That's not right," she whispered to herself. She adjusted her scope, sweeping across the ridge above the compound. Nothing. She swept again, slower this time. Still nothing. But something in her gut, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 3 deployments, refused to settle down. She had learned a long time ago never to ignore that feeling, no matter how many times logic told her she was wrong. "Overwatch to command," she said quietly. "The compound defenses look unusually light. I want you to consider that this could be a setup." There was a pause before Mitchell responded. "Copy Overwatch. We're aware it looks easy. Command believes the militia leadership pulled most of their fighters out for a supply run 2 days ago. Intelligence suggests the compound is genuinely undermanned." "I don't like it, Ryan," Emily said, dropping the formal call sign for a moment. "It's too quiet." "Understood. Stay sharp. We're moving in." Emily watched the 7 operators advance closer to the compound, weapons raise formation, tight and disciplined. Her eyes kept sweeping the terrain, refusing to trust the silence. Then she saw it, a flicker of movement along the eastern ridge, nearly 1,000 meters from the compound. She adjusted her scope immediately, the heart rate climbing, despite years of training that had taught her to control it. A man, then another. Then several more moving, low and fast between rock formations, weapons slung across their backs, faces covered against the cold. "Command, this is Overwatch," Emily said, her voice sharpening with urgency. "I have multiple hostiles on the eastern ridge, approximately 1,000 meters from your position, enclosing." "Confirm hostile count," Mitchell answered immediately, his voice tightening. Emily counted quickly, methodically, the way she had been trained to do under the worst possible pressure. "I count 12 so far." "Wait." She swept further along the ridge. Her stomach dropped. "Correction, I count 20. No, wait." Her breath caught. "I'm counting more than 30 fighters positioning along both ridge lines. This isn't a light defense. This is an ambush." Silence on the radio for a brief, terrible moment. "Say again, Overwatch." "It's a trap, Ryan. The compound was never the target. You are." Emily's hands moved instinctively over her weapon, though she reminded herself immediately that she wasn't supposed to fire. She was supposed to watch. She was supposed to report. That was the deal. "All units, this is command." Mitchell's voice cut through the radio, tense and controlled despite the chaos she knew was building in his mind. "Possible ambush. Repeat, possible ambush. Pull back to rally point Bravo immediately." But it was already too late. The first shot cracked through the frozen air like the snapping of the world itself. Then a second. Then dozens more erupting from both ridgelines, simultaneously, a coordinated wall of gunfire that turned the peaceful white valley into something out of a nightmare. "Contact, contact. We are taking fire from multiple directions," a panicked voice screamed over the radio. Emily watched through her scope, frozen for half a second by the horror of watching exactly what she had feared unfold in real time. The 7 SEAL operators scattered for cover, but the terrain offered almost nothing to hide behind. Explosions tore through the snow near their position, sending plumes of white and black into the night sky. "Command, I need sitrep now," Mitchell shouted, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. "2 men down. We have 2 men down." Emily's chest tightened. Her mind raced back instantly, painfully, to another night, another radio call, another moment when everything fell apart in seconds. She squeezed her eyes shut for half a heartbeat. Not again. Not this time. "Overwatch, I need eyes on enemy positions now." Mitchell's voice cut through her thoughts. Emily forced herself back into focus. "Copy. I have hostiles on both ridgelines. They have the higher ground, and they have you completely boxed in." She scanned quickly, her trained eye cataloging every detail with brutal efficiency. "Ryan, these aren't disorganized militia fighters. Look at their formation. They're moving in coordinated pairs. Someone trained these men." "Copy that, Overwatch. We need extraction." Emily's stomach dropped even further. She already knew what was coming. Negative command. A new voice broke in, strained and apologetic. Weather has grounded extraction birds. Stormfront moved in faster than predicted. No air support available for at least 90 minutes. 90 minutes. Emily knew the way she knew wind patterns and bullet trajectories that 7 men would not survive 90 minutes trapped in that valley. Copy. Mitchell said, his voice tight but steady, the voice of a leader refusing to let his men hear fear even as fear consumed him. We hold position, we fight. Emily watched through her scope as bullets tore into the snow around the SEAL team's position. One operator dragged a wounded teammate behind a small outcropping of rock, blood staining the white snow beneath him, a horrifying shade of red. Another operator returned fire in short, controlled bursts, but Emily could see his ammunition counter running low even from this distance. The way his movements had shifted from confident to conservative, rationing every shot. Talk to me, Overwatch. Mitchell's voice came through again, strained but focused. What do you see? Emily's mind raced through calculations, angles, distances, escape routes, anything that might give the trapped team a chance. Your east flank has the heaviest concentration of hostiles. If you can consolidate west, you might buy yourselves a few more minutes, but Ryan, they have the high ground on both sides. You're in a kill box. Copy that, Mitchell said, and Emily could hear something new in his voice. Now, something she recognized instantly because she had felt it herself once. The sound of a commander realizing his men might not make it home. Overwatch, Mitchell said quietly, almost too quietly for the radio to catch. If this goes bad, I need you to get word to my daughter. Tell her. Don't, Emily interrupted sharply. Don't you dare say that to me right now. Another explosion rocked the valley. Emily watched as a third operator went down, clutching his leg, screaming words she couldn't quite make out, but understood completely. Her finger moved instinctively toward her rifle's trigger guard, muscle memory older and deeper than 3 years of self-imposed exile could erase. She stopped herself, immediately pulling her hand back as if the weapon had burned her. Watch only. Don't engage. That was the deal. That was the promise she had made to herself the day she buried the last piece of Shadow Viper along with her guilt. But as she watched Commander Ryan Mitchell, a man she had personally trained, a man with a wife and a young daughter, waiting for him at home, drag a wounded soldier behind cover, while bullets tore up the ground around him, something inside Emily Carter began to crack. Command, this is Overwatch, she said, her voice suddenly steady in a way that surprised even her. I'm coming down. Negative, Overwatch, Mitchell answered immediately. You are intelligence support only. Those are your orders. Stay in position. Ryan, listen to me. That's an order, Captain. Emily's jaw tightened. For 3 years, she had followed exactly that kind of order. The order to stay back, to stay safe, to never again put herself in a position where one wrong decision could cost someone their life. For 3 years, it had worked in the sense that no one else had died because of her. But no one else had lived because of her either. She thought of Sarah, the 19-year-old aid worker, somewhere in these mountains, waiting for a birthday she might never see. She thought of 7 families back home who had no idea that tonight might be the night their phones rang with the worst news of their lives. And she thought of Michael, the way his voice used to sound calling out wind corrections, the way he had trusted her completely, right up until the moment that trust had cost him everything. She had spent 3 years punishing herself for the one life she couldn't save. She had forgotten how many lives she still could. Emily rose from her position in the snow, gathering her gear with the swift, practiced efficiency of a soldier who had never truly stopped being one, no matter how many years she had told herself otherwise. Overwatch, what are you doing? Mitchell's voice cracked through the radio, panic edging into his usually controlled tone. Emily didn't answer immediately. She was already moving, descending toward the valley floor, toward the gunfire, toward the exact kind of chaos she had sworn she would never willingly enter again. Below her, the battle raged on, and Emily Carter, once known as Shadow Viper, once the most feared sniper in her entire unit, moved through the darkness towards 7 men who had no idea that the woman who had spent 3 years running from her past was about to run directly into their nightmare to save them. A bullet cracked against a rock less than 3 feet from her head. Emily didn't flinch. She kept moving. Ryan, she said into her radio, her voice calm, now calmer than it had been in years. I'm not asking permission anymore. The radio went silent for a moment, filled only with the sound of distant gunfire and Emily's steady breathing. Overwatch, Mitchell finally said, his voice heavy with something between relief and dread. We need you. I know, Emily answered. I'm almost there. As she descended further into the valley, moving low and fast between rocks and frozen brush, Emily's mind cleared in a way it hadn't in 3 years. The guilt was still there. The memory of Michael was still there. But underneath it, something else had woken up, something she thought she had buried forever. The part of her that refused to let good people die when she had the power to stop it. She reached a small ridge overlooking the battlefield and dropped low, scanning the chaos below. With new eyes, no longer the eyes of an observer, but the eyes of someone about to become part of the fight. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the terrifying, familiar rush of adrenaline she had denied herself for 3 long years. Below her, Commander Mitchell dragged another wounded operator behind cover, screaming orders into his radio, trying desperately to hold together a team that was rapidly running out of ammunition options and time. Emily's eyes swept across the enemy positions, cataloging strengths and weaknesses with brutal, practiced efficiency. Then her gaze landed on something that made her blood run cold. A massive cliff face rose above the entire valley, nearly 50 meters high, overlooking every enemy position, every SEAL operator, every inch of the battlefield below. Whoever controlled that cliff controlled the entire fight, and right now, no one controlled it at all. Emily stared at the icy, treacherous rock face, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than guilt rising inside her chest. She felt purpose. Command, she said into her radio, her voice steady and sharp, cutting through the chaos like a blade. I need you to hold on just a little bit longer. Overwatch, where are you? Mitchell's voice was ragged, now exhausted, barely holding on to control. Emily's eyes remained locked on the cliff face, calculating angles, wind resistance, ice thickness. Every variable that could mean the difference between life and death for 7 men she had sworn to protect from a distance. I'm about to become a lot more than intelligence support, she said quietly. Then Emily Carter, once the most feared sniper in her unit, once a woman who swore she would never fight again, took a deep breath, gripped the frozen rock in front of her, and began to climb toward a decision that would either save 7 American lives or cost her everything she had left to lose. Below her, the gunfire continued, relentless and merciless. The screams of wounded men mixing with explosions that lit up the night sky in flashes of orange and white. Commander Mitchell's voice crackled through her radio one final time before she reached the base of the cliff. Overwatch, I don't know what you're planning, but whatever it is, we're running out of time. Emily's hands found the first icy handhold on the cliff face. I know, she whispered, mostly to herself, mostly to the memory of a man who had once trusted her with his life and paid the ultimate price for it. This time I'm not going to be too late. She began to climb each movement, sending sharp pain through fingers already numb from cold, each foothold, uncertain against ice that could give way at any moment. Below her, 7 men fought for their lives, unaware that the woman who had once been called Shadow Viper was about to reclaim a name she thought she had buried forever, along with a piece of herself she thought she had lost on a rooftop in Syria 18 months before Christmas Eve had ever become the night that would change everything. The wind howled around her as gunfire continued to echo through the valley below, and Emily Carter climbed higher into the darkness, carrying with her 3 years of guilt, the memory of a man she couldn't save, and a desperate burning need to make sure that tonight, unlike that terrible night in Syria, she would not fail the people counting on her. Halfway up the cliff face, her boots slipped against a patch of black ice hidden beneath fresh snow. Her body swung outward into empty space, held only by the strength of her fingers gripping a narrow ledge barely wide enough to hold on to. For one heart-stopping second, Emily hung suspended between the battlefield below and the icy darkness above. And in that single terrifying moment, she felt Michael's presence beside her the way she always did, in moments of extreme danger, as if some part of him had never truly left. Not today, she growled through her gritted teeth, pulling herself back against the rock face with strength she didn't know she still had. She continued climbing. Behind her, unnoticed in the chaos of battle, 2 enemy fighters had been dispatched to secure the very cliff Emily was climbing toward, sent by a commander who understood exactly how dangerous that position could be if the wrong person ever reached it. They were already near the top, weapons raised, watching the valley below, with cold, calculating eyes, completely unaware that a ghost from America's past was climbing silently up the ice directly beneath them, closing the distance between herself and a confrontation that would determine whether 7 American soldiers lived to see Christmas morning or became 7 more names added to a list of tragedies that never made the evening news. 10 feet below the summit, Emily froze against the rock, every muscle locked in place. Voices, 2 of them speaking low, careful, the kind of quiet that only came from men who had been ordered to stay hidden. She pressed herself flat against the ice breath, held listening. "Nothing up here," one voice muttered in accented English, low and bored. "Commander wasted 2 of us on a rock nobody's climbing." "Orders are orders," the second voice answered. He said, "Secure the high ground." So we secure the high ground. Emily's fingers tightened against the frozen stone. 2 men, positioned exactly where she needed to be. She had no rope, no backup, and a rifle slung across her back that would be useless in the next 30 seconds unless she got past them first. She thought about Mitchell's voice cracking over the radio. 2 men down. She thought about the wounded operator dragging himself behind a rock while blood soaked through the snow beneath him. She thought about Sarah, 19 years old, waiting somewhere in these mountains for a birthday that was now 4 days closer. There was no version of tonight where she climbed back down. Emily pulled herself over the final ledge in one smooth, silent motion. Years of training taking over where fear tried to creep in. The first guard turned half a second too late. She was already inside his reach, one hand clamping over his mouth, the other driving upward with the full weight of her body behind it. He folded without a sound. The second guard spun, weapon rising, eyes wide, with the particular terror of a man realizing the ghost stories were real. Shah. He never finished the word. Emily closed the distance before he could bring the barrel of Oso, using his own momentum against him, driving him down onto the ice hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. Her knee found his sternum. Her forearm found his throat. 10 seconds later, both men lay unconscious in the snow, disarmed, and Emily Carter stood alone at the top of the world, looking down at a battlefield that was rapidly turning into a graveyard. "Command, this is Overwatch," she said into her radio, voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. "I'm in position on the eastern cliff. I have eyes on everything." "Overwatch, say again?" Mitchell's voice cracked with disbelief. "You're on the cliff. How the hell did you—" "Later, Ryan." Emily cut him off, already dropping into position, already sighting down the valley through her scope, already feeling 3 years of self-imposed exile fall away like snow, sliding off a rooftop. "Give me your situation. Now." Below the valley was chaos given form. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like strobe lights, some from the SEAL position, most from the ridgelines surrounding them. Through her scope, Emily could see Mitchell crouched behind a boulder, no bigger than a car, dragging a wounded man by the collar of his jacket, while return fire chipped rock fragments off the stone inches from his head. "We have 4 operational, 3 wounded," Mitchell said, breathless. "Ammunition critical on at least 2 weapons. We cannot hold this position much longer." "Overwatch." Emily's eyes swept the enemy line. 30-plus fighters, maybe more, spread across both ridges in disciplined firing positions. But discipline meant patterns. Patterns meant predictability. And predictability was the one thing Shadow Viper had never lost, no matter how many years she spent pretending she wasn't her anymore. "I have their machine gun position," Emily said. "Northeast Ridge, second outcropping. He's the one keeping your heads down." "Copy. Take him." Emily settled her breathing the way she had 10,000 times before, the way her body remembered even when her mind tried to forget. Inhale. Exhale halfway. Hold. Her finger found the trigger. She hesitated. For a fraction of a second, the memory rose up uninvited, sharp, and merciless. Michael's voice. Winds shifting. Give it 2 more seconds." Below her, another explosion rocked the SEAL position. A scream tore through the night, high and desperate, the sound of a man realizing he might not survive the next 60 seconds. Emily exhaled the memory along with her breath. She fired. 400 meters below, the machine gunner's silhouette dropped instantly, the weapon falling silent mid-burst. For half a second, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. "Guns down!" Mitchell shouted, disbelief and relief tangled together in his voice. "Overwatch, that's a confirmed kill. That's incredible. Keep going." Emily was already moving to her next target, cycling the bolt with mechanical precision, scanning for the next threat before the first body had even finished falling. She found a second fighter repositioning toward higher ground, clearly trying to relocate for a better angle on the SEALs below. "Second target, West Ridge, moving to flank your position," she said, already adjusting for windage. She fired again. The fighter dropped mid-stride. "Confirmed," Mitchell breathed. Overwatch, you're turning this around. But Emily knew better than anyone that a battlefield could turn twice in the same night. Through her scope, she watched the enemy formation shift, fighters scrambling to reposition, voices shouting in a language she didn't fully understand, but recognized the tone of instantly. Panic, confusion, the realization that an invisible threat had entered the fight from an angle nobody had planned for. Then a new voice crackled through the enemy's chatter, picked up faintly by the SEAL team's air signal interception equipment, and relayed to Mitchell's earpiece before he passed it along. Overwatch, we're picking up enemy comms. Someone's giving orders. Sounds like their commander. Can you translate? Negative, but whoever it is, he's not panicking. He's redirecting fighters toward the cliff. Emily, they know you're up there. Emily's stomach tightened. She had known this moment would come. A position this powerful couldn't stay hidden forever. Not once bodies started dropping from angles no one expected. She scanned the terrain below her cliff face, searching for movement, for the telltale signs of fighters attempting to climb toward her. Copy that, she said. I'll deal with it. Focus on your wounded. Overwatch, listen to me. Mitchell's voice dropped urgent and low. If they reach that cliff, you have no backup up there. No exit. You'll be trapped. I know. Emily. I said I know, Ryan. Her voice hardened not from anger, but from a resolve that had been buried for 3 years and was only now clawing its way back to the surface. I'm not leaving this position. Not while you have wounded men down there. Focus on keeping your team alive. I'll handle the rest. She heard Mitchell exhale hard, the sound of a commander forced to trust someone else's judgment in the middle of the worst night of his career. Copy, he finally said. God help anyone who comes up that cliff after you. Below the wounded operator Mitchell had been dragging, let out another pained groan, and through her scope, Emily watched Mitchell tear open a medical kit with shaking hands, pressing gauze against a wound in the man's thigh that was bleeding far too fast for comfort. Talk to me, Doc, Mitchell said, though Emily could hear the strain in his voice, the desperate attempt to sound calm for a man who was quickly losing consciousness. Femorals, Nick, the medic's voice answered, tight and clinical, the voice of a man trying not to let panic bleed into his words. I need him stable in the next 10 minutes or we lose him. 10 minutes. Emily's jaw clenched. She swept her scope back across the battlefield, searching for any threat that could buy the wounded man more time or take it away entirely. That was when she saw it, a group of 6 fighters breaking off from the main assault, moving in a tight formation toward the base of her cliff. They knew exactly where she was. Command, I have 6 hostiles moving toward my position, Emily said, voice flattening into pure combat focus. They're trying to flank me from below. Can you hold? Emily glanced at the narrow, icy approach leading up to her position, the only path a climber could realistically take without ropes and equipment. It was a bottleneck, a single point of entry, the kind of terrain that could be held by one determined person against many if that person knew exactly what she was doing. I can hold, she said. Watch your own 6. I've got mine. She repositioned herself near the narrow ledge rifle, steady eyes locked on the base of the climb, where the first fighter was already beginning his ascent, moving fast, confident, clearly experienced. Emily waited patient despite the chaos below, patient despite the screaming urgency in every cell of her body. The first fighter's head crested the ledge. Emily fired. He dropped instantly, tumbling backward into the darkness, taking a second fighter down with him in a tangle of limbs and falling snow. The remaining 4 scattered for cover, shouting warnings to each other, suddenly aware that the woman on the cliff wasn't going to be an easy kill. 2 down, Emily reported, already scanning for the next threat. 4 remaining at the base. They've gone to ground. Copy, Overwatch. Nice shooting. Emily didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were locked on movement near the compound itself, something she hadn't noticed before in the chaos. A door previously hidden in shadow had opened. 3 figures emerged, hands bound, moving unsteadily, flanked by 2 armed guards. Her heart stopped. Command, she said slowly. I have visual on what looks like 3 hostages being moved from the compound, possibly your aid workers. Mitchell's voice sharpened immediately. Confirm position. Southern entrance moving east toward a secondary structure. 2 guards, both armed, moving fast. Emily adjusted her scope, heart pounding, as she studied the smaller of the 3 captives, a young woman with dark hair matted against her face, stumbling, but alive. Ryan, I think I have Sarah. There was a long pause on the radio, filled only with distant gunfire and the sound of Mitchell's ragged breathing. If they're moving the hostages, that means someone up the chain just decided we're a threat worth silencing witnesses over, he said grimly. We need to move on that position now before they decide those three are more trouble alive than dead. Agreed, but Ryan, you're pinned down with wounded. You don't have the manpower to split off a hostage rescue element. I know. His voice was tight with the particular anguish of a commander facing an impossible choice. But if we don't move now, we might not get another chance. Emily's mind raced, calculating angles, distances, timing every variable that separated a successful rescue from a catastrophe. Then her eyes caught something else through the chaos of returning fire and the swirling snow kicked up by explosions. She noticed the enemy formation had a gap, a brief window where the guards escorting the hostages would pass through an open stretch of ground with no cover. I can take both guards from here, Emily said, but the timing has to be perfect. The moment they clear that gap, I fire. You need someone ready to move the second those hostages are unguarded. I'll send Torres and Whitman. They're the least wounded. Copy. Tell them to move fast. I won't have more than a 3-second window. Understood. Standing by on your mark. Emily settled back into position, tracking the 2 guards and their 3 captives as they moved slowly across the open ground. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat slowed. The entire world narrowed down to a single point of focus, the way it always did in these moments, the way it had felt right before everything went wrong in Syria 18 months ago. She pushed the memory away. Not now, not when 3 innocent lives depended on the next 10 seconds going exactly right. Almost there, she murmured, mostly to herself. Almost. The first guard cleared the gap. The second guard followed half a step behind. Mark, Emily said, and fired twice in rapid succession. Both guards dropped simultaneously, and for one suspended, terrifying second, the 3 hostages stood frozen in the open, uncertain what had just happened. Uncertain whether they were free or about to become collateral damage in a crossfire, they didn't understand. Go, go, go! Mitchell's voice erupted through the radio, and Emily watched through her scope as 2 SEAL operators broke from cover, sprinting across open ground toward the hostages with a speed that seemed almost impossible, given the gunfire still tearing through the valley around them. Contact left, one of the SEALs shouted, as enemy fighters, alerted by the sudden movement, began redirecting fire toward the rescue team. Emily's scope swept immediately to the new threat, finding 3 fighters repositioning to cut off the rescue attempt. She fired once, twice, dropping 2 of them before they could bring their weapons to bear. The third dove for cover, disappearing behind a rock formation just as her third shot cracked against stone, inches from where his head had been. Overwatch hostages secured, moving them back to our position. Relief flooded through Emily's chest, sharp and unexpected, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to fully experience in years. But relief was a luxury she couldn't afford to dwell on, not with the battle still raging and her own position increasingly under threat. Below her cliff, the 4 remaining fighters at the base had regrouped, and now Emily could see them attempting a new approach, spreading out to attack the narrow climbing path from 2 directions simultaneously. They're trying to split my attention, she muttered, already adjusting her position to cover both angles as best she could. The radio crackled again, this time carrying a note of alarm that made Emily's blood run cold. Overwatch, we're picking up something new on enemy frequencies. The signal's operator's voice came through, tense and urgent. There's a drone, small reconnaissance type. They just launched it, and Emily, the chatter suggests they're specifically trying to relocate your position. Emily's stomach tightened. A drone changed everything. It meant her advantage of surprise, the very thing that had allowed her to turn this battle around in the span of minutes, was about to disappear. Copy, she said, scanning the sky above the valley, searching for any sign of the small aircraft against the darkness. I'll deal with it when I see it. Emily, listen. Mitchell's voice dropped low, serious in a way that cut through the chaos. The way they're moving, the way they adapted so fast, this isn't standard militia behavior. Whoever's commanding this operation knows exactly what they're doing. This was never just about the hostages. Emily's jaw tightened. She had suspected the same thing from the moment she'd spotted the 2 relaxed guards, the too easy approach, the ambush waiting on both ridgelines, like a trap set by someone who understood precisely how American units operated. You think this was a setup from the start, she said. It wasn't a question. I think someone wanted us here specifically, Mitchell answered grimly. And I think whoever it is knows exactly who you are, Emily. The way those fighters reacted the second the machine gun went down, the way they immediately started searching the high ground instead of scattering in panic. That's not the reaction of men fighting a random American patrol. That's the reaction of men who were warned that Shadow Viper might be watching. The words hit Emily like a physical blow. For 3 years, she had believed her retirement from combat had been quiet private, known only to a small circle of people within her own command structure. The idea that someone on the other side of the world, someone commanding enemy fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, might know her name, might have specifically prepared for the possibility of her involvement, sent a cold chill through her chest that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature around her. "That's not possible," she said, though even as she spoke, the words doubt crept into her voice. "I don't know how, but Emily, I need you to consider it. If someone specifically planned for you to be here, then this ambush was never really about hostages or aid workers. It was about drawing you out." Emily's mind raced backward, searching for any possible explanation, any leak, any connection between her quiet life as a tactical instructor and the enemy commander orchestrating chaos in the valley below her. She found nothing immediately, but the unease refused to leave her chest. "Command, this is Torres." A new voice broke into the radio, breathless from exertion. "Hostages secured behind cover. The girl's in shock, but she's alive. Older two have some injuries, but they'll survive." "Copy, Torres, good work," Mitchell answered, though his voice remained tight with the tension of everything Emily had just revealed to him. "Overwatch, can you still hold your position?" Emily's eyes swept the darkness above the valley, searching for the drone that was somewhere out there hunting for her exact coordinates. "I can hold," she said. "But Ryan, if that drone finds me, every fighter down there is going to know exactly where to aim." "Understood. We're working on getting a jammer online, but it's going to take time we might not have." Emily returned her focus to the four fighters attempting to flank her position from below, forcing herself to compartmentalize the unsettling revelation about being specifically targeted. She had a job to do. 7 men, 3 hostages, in an entire valley full of danger demanded her complete attention, regardless of what questions lingered about why this night had unfolded the way it had. The fighters below had split into 2 pairs, each attempting a different angle of approach up the icy rock face. Emily tracked the first pair through her scope, timing their movement and waiting for the precise moment when both climbers would be exposed simultaneously. "Come on," she whispered, "just a little further." The moment came. Both fighters emerged from cover at the same instant, scrambling across an exposed section of ice roughly 30 meters below her position. Emily fired twice in rapid succession, and both fighters dropped their bodies, sliding down the icy slope in a tangle of limbs and equipment. "2 more down," she reported. But even as she spoke, she caught movement in her peripheral vision, a small shape cutting silently through the darkness above the valley, moving with a deliberate mechanical precision that no living creature could match. The drone. "Command, I have visual on the drone," Emily said, tracking the small aircraft as it swept slowly across the battlefield, clearly searching for something specific. "It's moving toward my position. Can you shoot it down?" Emily studied the drone's flight patterns, watching it bank and turn with practiced regularity. Small, fast-moving targets were notoriously difficult to hit with a standard rifle round, but not impossible for someone who understood patterns the way she did. "I can try, but if I miss, I'll have given away my exact position for nothing." "Your call, Overwatch." Emily watched the drone continue its methodical sweep, and something in its movement pattern caught her attention. Every few seconds, right before it changed direction, there was a brief, almost imperceptible pause, the kind of hesitation built into its programming to stabilize the camera before executing a turn. She had seen patterns like this before. Patterns could be predicted. Predicted patterns could be exploited. "Not yet," she said more to herself than to the radio. "Let it come closer." The drone continued its search pattern, sweeping closer to her position with each pass, and Emily forced herself to remain perfectly still, trusting the darkness and her camouflage to keep her hidden a little while longer. Below her, the remaining 2 fighters at the base of the cliff had apparently decided the climb was too costly, retreating back toward the main battlefield instead. "Overwatch, we've got a bigger problem." Mitchell's voice cut through tense and urgent. "Our wounded operator, the one with the femoral wound, he's crashing. Doc says we need to get him stabilized in the next 5 minutes or we lose him." Emily's chest tightened. 5 minutes. The drone was circling closer. The remaining enemy forces were regrouping for what felt like an inevitable final push, and now a man's life hung by a thread that was quickly fraying to nothing. "What do you need from me?" she asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "I need you to keep their heads down while Doc works. If they get eyes on our position again, we're not going to survive the next assault." Emily's mind raced through the tactical possibilities, weighing the risk of revealing her position further against the certainty of losing a man's life if she didn't act. There was no clean answer, no perfect solution that kept everyone completely safe. There never was, not in war, not in the kind of impossible calculus that had haunted her every single night since Syria. "Copy," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "I'll keep them busy." She shifted her focus back to the main battlefield, searching for the largest concentration of remaining enemy fighters, the group most likely to organize a coordinated assault, while the SEAL medic worked frantically to save a dying man's life. She found them regrouping near a rock formation, roughly 600 meters from her position, at least 15 fighters consolidating for what was clearly about to become a final desperate push. Emily adjusted her scope, calculating windage, distance, and elevation, with the ease of someone whose body remembered every lesson, even when her mind had spent years trying to forget them. She fired. One fighter dropped. She cycled the bolt and fired again. A second fighter fell, and the group scattered in momentary confusion, shouting warnings to each other as they realized the sniper who had already devastated their ranks was still very much active and now targeting their main formation directly. "Command, I'm engaging their main group," Emily reported, already tracking her next target. "This should buy Doc some time." "Copy, Overwatch, keep it up, we need every second." Below, through fragmented radio chatter and the chaos of ongoing gunfire, Emily could hear the medic's voice, tight with desperate concentration, working to save a man's life while the world around him exploded in violence. She fired again and again, methodically breaking down the enemy's ability to organize every shot, buying precious seconds for a wounded soldier she had never met, but was determined not to let die tonight. Then the drone's engine pitch changed. Emily's instincts screamed a warning half a second before her conscious mind fully processed what had happened. The small aircraft had stopped its search pattern and was now hovering, camera locked directly on her position. It had found her. "Command, the drone has me," Emily said, urgency sharpening her voice. "They know exactly where I am." "Overwatch, get out of there!" "No time," Emily answered, already calculating her next move. Below, she could see fighters redirecting immediately, no longer scattered in confusion, but converging with terrifying purpose toward the base of her cliff, weapons raised clearly, having received exact coordinates from whoever was piloting that drone. Emily raised her rifle, tracking the small aircraft as it hovered nearly 200 meters away, transmitting her exact location to every enemy fighter still capable of holding a weapon. She had one chance to end this threat before her position became completely untenable. She remembered the pattern she had studied earlier, the pause before the turn, the brief hesitation built into its stabilization system. But the drone wasn't turning now. It was hovering, locked, transmitting. Her only option was a shot she had never attempted under this kind of pressure, against a target this small at this distance, with dozens of enemy fighters closing in and a man's life hanging in the balance 300 meters below her. Emily exhaled slowly. Her finger found the trigger. Below, gunfire erupted with new intensity as enemy fighters began climbing toward her position from multiple directions at once, no longer cautious, no longer worried about casualties, driven only by the desperate need to eliminate the sniper who had turned their ambush into a slaughter. "Overwatch, they're coming up the cliff. All sides, I count at least 10 fighters." Mitchell's voice cracked with alarm. "You need to move now." Emily's finger remained steady on the trigger, her eyes locked on the drone hovering in the darkness above the chaos, her mind calculating the single shot that could either save her position or waste the last precious seconds she had before the enemy reached her. "Emily," Mitchell's voice was raw, now stripped of formality, filled with genuine fear for a woman he had once trained and now desperately needed to survive the next 60 seconds. "Talk to me." Emily didn't answer. She fired. And in the silence that followed, as the drone's camera feed went dark somewhere in an enemy command post miles away, Emily Carter realized that the shot she had just taken had done nothing to stop the 10 armed fighters now scrambling up the icy cliff face toward her. Exposed position, weapons raised, faces twisted with the kind of fury that came from watching more than a dozen of their comrades fall to a single hidden shooter in the space of a few devastating minutes. She was out of time, Out of easy options and completely alone at the top of a 50-meter cliff, with a wounded man dying below her and an enemy force closing in from every direction at once. The first fighter's head appeared over the eastern ledge exactly 4 seconds after Emily's shot silenced the drone, and she was already moving, already rolling away from her original position toward a narrow crevice in the rock that offered the only real cover this exposed summit had to give her. "Emily, talk to me," Mitchell's voice tore through her earpiece, raw with something close to panic. "Are you hit? Say something." "I'm alive," she said through gritted teeth, pressing her back against frozen stone as bullets chewed into the rock inches from her shoulder. 10 fighters climbing from 3 directions. "I need you to trust me and focus on your wounded man." "I've got this." "You don't have this. You're 1 person against 10 armed. Ryan," her voice cut through his sharp and absolute. "Trust me." There was a pause filled only with gunfire and the sound of Mitchell's ragged breathing 300 meters below. "Copy," he finally said, though every syllable carried the weight of a man forced to accept a decision he hated. "God be with you." Emily peered around the edge of the crevice, tracking the first climber as he hauled himself over the ledge weapon, already sweeping the summit in a desperate arc, searching for the woman who had turned his entire unit into a graveyard in the span of 10 minutes. She fired once. He dropped without a sound, sliding back down the icy slope he had just fought so hard to climb. 9. A second fighter appeared almost immediately, clearly having learned from his comrade's mistake, moving low and fast, weapon already firing in a wild, panicked spray that forced Emily deeper into her crevice, chips of rock exploding around her face. She waited. Patience had always been her greatest weapon, more valuable than any rifle, more reliable than any tactic. The fighter's magazine ran dry in a burst of desperate fire, and in the half-second silence that followed, Emily leaned out and ended it. 8. Overwatch status. Mitchell's voice crackled through tense with the effort of not asking the question he really wanted to ask. 8 remaining. Emily answered, already reloading her hands, moving with mechanical precision, despite the adrenaline screaming through her body. "They're not stopping." "Neither are we. Doc's got the bleeding slowed, but he needs more time." "Then I'll give him more time." Below, 3 more fighters emerged simultaneously from different angles, clearly having coordinated their approach after watching 2 of their comrades die, trying to rush her position individually. Emily's mind raced through the geometry of her tiny fortress, calculating angles, exposure, the brutal mathematics of survival against overwhelming numbers. She couldn't cover 3 directions at once. Not with a bolt-action rifle, not alone. The first fighter crested the northern ledge. Emily fired, dropping him, but the movement exposed her position to the second fighter climbing from the west, who immediately opened fire, forcing her to abandon her cover and scramble toward a different outcropping, just as bullets tore through the space where she had been standing a heartbeat earlier. 7. But now the third fighter had reached the summit from the south, and Emily found herself caught in the open for one horrifying exposed second rifle, raised but not yet aimed, the fighter's weapon already tracking toward her chest. Time slowed the way it always did in the worst moments of her life. She threw herself sideways as his shot cracked past her ear, or close enough that she felt the heat of it against her skin. Her shoulders slammed into ice. Pain exploded through her ribs, the same ribs she had bruised climbing up here in the first place. But she didn't stop moving, rolling behind a boulder and coming up firing in one continuous motion, born from thousands of hours of training that never truly left the body, no matter how many years the mind tried to bury it. The fighter dropped. 6. Emily pressed her back against the boulder chest, heaving, blood trickling from a cut above her eyebrow, where a rock fragment had caught her during the fall. Her hands were shaking now, not from cold, but from the sheer volume of adrenaline flooding her system. She forced herself to breathe, forced her mind back into the cold, calculating focus that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. "Overwatch, we're hearing gunfire close to your position. What's happening up there?" Mitchell's voice was tight with barely controlled fear. 6 left, Emily said, reloading with fingers that refused to stop trembling. "They're smarter than the first wave. Coordinated. Can you hold?" Emily glanced around at her position, taking stock of her ammunition, her injuries, the diminishing cover available to her on this increasingly exposed summit. Honestly, she didn't know. But honesty wasn't what Mitchell needed right now, not with a dying man in his arms and 6 more soldiers depending on him to make impossible decisions under fire. "I can hold," she said, and prayed it was true. Below, in a voice she almost missed beneath the chaos, Emily heard the medic's tone shift, something changing in the rhythm of his words that made her chest tighten with dread. "Command, we're losing him," the medic said, and his voice had gone flat. A professional, the particular calm that came right before someone's entire world fell apart. "Pulse is thready. I need to get him warm, and I need to get him elevated, or we lose him in the next few minutes." "Do what you can, Doc," Mitchell answered, though Emily could hear the crack forming beneath his controlled exterior. "You keep him breathing, you hear me? You keep him breathing." Emily's jaw tightened. She thought of the 7 families who had no idea tonight might be the night everything changed forever. She thought of a wife somewhere in the United States asleep in her bed, unaware that her husband was bleeding out on a frozen mountainside 8,000 miles away, while a woman who used to be someone else fought to buy him a few more minutes of life. She pushed off the boulder and moved. 2 fighters appeared simultaneously from the eastern approach, clearly having regrouped after losing 4 of their comrades in the span of minutes. Emily fired twice in rapid succession, the shots blending together into a single continuous motion, and both fighters dropped before either could bring a weapon to bear. 4. But the remaining 4 had learned, and this time they didn't climb directly toward her. They spread out using the terrain approaching from angles designed to force her into an impossible choice about which threat to prioritize. Emily's mind raced. 4 fighters, 1 rifle, limited ammunition, a summit that offered less cover with every passing minute as the fighting chipped away at the rock formations she had been using to survive. "Come on," she whispered to herself, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. "Where are you?" A shape emerged from the northern ridge, moving with careful, deliberate steps. Weapon raised and ready, Emily tracked him through her scope, finger tightening on the trigger. Then everything changed at once. Gunfire erupted from a completely unexpected direction, not from Emily's rifle, but from somewhere behind the 4 remaining fighters, catching them completely by surprise. 2 of them dropped instantly, cut down by fire they never saw coming. The remaining 2 spun weapons, rising toward this new threat, and Emily used the momentary confusion to end one of them herself before he could react. 1 fighter remained, and he was already running, abandoning the fight entirely, scrambling back down the cliff face in a desperate, undignified retreat. Emily let him go. Killing a man who was no longer a threat wasn't the mission. Saving lives was. "Command, what just happened?" she said into her radio, breathing hard, scanning the summit for the source of the unexpected covering fire. "That was us," a new voice answered, one Emily didn't immediately recognize, breathless and strained. "Torres and Whitman. We circled around while you kept their attention on the cliff. Figured you could use a hand." Relief flooded through Emily's chest, sharp and overwhelming. "Copy that. Good timing." "Overwatch," Mitchell's voice broke in, and something in his tone made Emily's stomach drop before he even finished the sentence. "We need you down here. Now. Doc's losing him." Emily didn't hesitate. She was already moving, scrambling toward the descent path, ignoring the pain screaming through her ribs and the cut still bleeding above her eye. The climb down was faster than the climb up, driven by desperation rather than caution, and she reached the SEAL position in a fraction of the time it had taken her to ascend, dropping into cover beside Mitchell, just as the medic pulled back from the wounded operator with an expression that told her everything before he said a word. "His pulse is barely there," the medic said, hands still pressed against the wound, blood soaking through gauze faster than he could replace it. "I've done everything I can out here. He needs a hospital, and he needs it now." Mitchell's face was ash gray, the particular exhaustion of a commander who had spent the last 20 minutes watching his men bleed and die while feeling powerless to stop any of it. He looked at Emily, and for a moment the mask of command slipped, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "We can't get him out," he said quietly. "The storm's still grounding air support. We're miles from any vehicle extraction. Emily, he's going to die up here." Emily looked down at the wounded man, young, barely older than Sarah, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the freezing temperatures around them. She thought of Michael, of a moment 18 months ago when she had been the one standing helpless, while someone she loved slipped away in front of her. She was not going to let that happen again. Not tonight. "How far to the nearest extraction point that could handle a vehicle?" she asked, already thinking through the terrain, the timing, the impossible math of distance versus a dying man's remaining minutes. "There's an old service road about 2 miles east," Mitchell said, "but we'd need transport, and we don't have any." "They do," Emily said, nodding toward the compound in the distance. The place this entire mission had originally been targeting before the ambush changed everything. If there are vehicles down there, we use them. Mitchell stared at her. That compound is still crawling with enemy fighters. Not as many as it was 10 minutes ago, Emily said grimly. And every minute we spend debating this is a minute he doesn't have. Mitchell looked at his wounded operator, then at the remaining members of his team, exhausted wounded running dangerously low on ammunition. Then he looked at Emily, and something passed between them, an understanding built from years of trust that neither guilt nor time had managed to fully erase. Torres Whitman, you are with me, Mitchell said, his voice hardening back into command mode. We move on that compound. We find a vehicle. We get our man out of here. Overwatch. I'm coming with you, Emily said before he could finish. You need eyes that can see what's coming before it arrives. Mitchell nodded, understanding there was no point arguing. Doc, keep him stable. We'll be back before you know it. Make it fast, the medic said, pressing fresh gauze against the wound with hands that hadn't stopped moving in 20 minutes. The four of them moved through the darkness toward the compound. Emily taking point despite her injuries, every sense sharpened by the desperate urgency of the mission. The valley around them had gone eerily quiet. The gunfire that had defined the last 20 minutes replaced by a silence that felt somehow more dangerous, more uncertain. Too quiet, Emily murmured, echoing the same words she had said hours earlier when this entire nightmare began. You think there's more waiting for us? Torres asked, his voice tight with exhaustion and adrenaline. I think we've already been wrong once tonight about how easy this was supposed to be, Emily answered. I'm not making that mistake twice. They approached the compound carefully, using every scrap of cover the terrain offered, and Emily's trained eye immediately cataloged the aftermath of the earlier fighting. Bodies scattered across the snow, abandoned weapons, and near the center of the compound, exactly what they needed: 2 military transport vehicles, engines cold but intact. There, Emily said, pointing toward the vehicles. If we can get one of those running. A voice cut through the darkness, sharp and commanding, speaking in accented but clear English. I would not move any closer if I were you, Captain Carter. Every member of the team froze instantly, weapons rising toward the source of the voice, though the darkness made it impossible to immediately locate the speaker. Emily's blood ran cold, not from fear of the threat itself, but from the way her name had just been spoken, calm and certain by a man she had never met. Show yourself, Mitchell called out, his weapon sweeping the shadows. A figure emerged slowly from behind one of the transport vehicles. Hands raised but not in surrender, more in the calm, deliberate gesture of a man who believed himself completely in control of the situation, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. He was older than Emily expected, gray threading through dark hair, his uniform marking him as someone of significant rank within whatever organization had orchestrated tonight's ambush. You know my name, Emily said, her voice steady despite the ice spreading through her chest. How? The man smiled, an expression that held no warmth, only cold satisfaction. Shadow Viper, the ghost who disappeared 3 years ago after a rooftop in Syria went very, very wrong. Did you really think that story stayed contained within your own military? Emily's finger tightened on her trigger, though something in the man's confidence, standing alone against 4 armed operators, told her this conversation wasn't finished, that he had more to say, and that whatever he said next would change everything she thought she understood about tonight. Who are you? She demanded. My name is not important, the man said, lowering his hands slowly, still smiling that same cold, knowing smile. What is important, Captain, is that you understand exactly what you walked into tonight. This was never about 3 aid workers. This was never even about your soldiers. His eyes locked directly onto Emily's, and something in them carried a weight of personal significance that made her stomach twist. This was about you. That's impossible, Emily said, though even as the words left her mouth, doubt crept into her voice, echoing the same suspicion Mitchell had voiced earlier. Nobody outside my command knew I was coming tonight. Nobody within your command needed to know, the man replied. We have known about you for a very long time, Captain Carter. We have known about the rooftop in Syria. We have known about Sergeant Michael Reynolds. He paused deliberately, watching her face for a reaction he clearly expected to find. We have known that a woman carrying that much guilt would eventually be pulled back into the fight if the right circumstances presented themselves. All we needed to do was create those circumstances and wait. Emily felt the ground shift beneath her, not literally, but in every sense that mattered. The ambush, the captured aid workers, the 2 relaxed guards designed to lure a rescue team into a trap. All of it, every carefully orchestrated piece of tonight's nightmare, had been constructed for one purpose: to draw her out of hiding. Why? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though every instinct screamed at her to keep her weapon trained and her guard raised. The man's smile widened slightly, and for the first time something darker flickered behind his eyes, something personal, something that went beyond simple military strategy. Because 3 years ago, Captain, your actions on that rooftop in Syria did not only cost you your friend, they cost me someone as well. Emily's breath caught. What are you talking about? The building that fell that night, the man said, his voice hardening with barely restrained emotion. It was not simply a military target. My brother was inside that structure, working undercover, embedded exactly where your intelligence believed hostile combatants were operating. He died in that collapse along with your sergeant, both of them casualties of a mission that went wrong in ways neither side fully understood at the time. Emily's mind raced backward through 18 months of guilt, of endless nights replaying every second of that mission, searching for the moment she could have done something differently. She had never known, never even considered that the tragedy she carried might be connected to a grief on the other side of the world that mirrored her own. I didn't know, she said, and the words felt inadequate, hollow, completely insufficient against the weight of what she was hearing. Of course you didn't, the man said bitterly. Your government called it collateral damage, buried it in a report nobody outside a small circle would ever read. But I have spent 3 years learning everything about you, Captain. I have studied your service record, your training, the way you think, the way you calculate risk. I built tonight specifically to test whether the ghost stories were true, whether Shadow Viper still existed beneath a tactical instructor hiding in a classroom, pretending she had left that life behind. And now that you know, Emily asked, her weapon still raised, her mind racing through the implications of everything she had just learned. Now I know, the man said quietly, that killing you quickly would have been a mercy you do not deserve. His hand moved slowly toward his jacket, and every weapon in the team snapped toward him instantly, fingers tightening on triggers. Don't, Mitchell warned, his voice low and dangerous. The man paused, hands still hovering near his jacket, and something in his expression shifted, calculating, reassessing. There is something you should know before this conversation ends, he said. Tonight was never meant to succeed as an ambush against your soldiers. It was meant to succeed as a test. And Captain Carter, you have passed that test in ways I did not fully anticipate. What does that mean? Emily demanded. It means the real operation begins the moment you believe this fight is over, the man said, and before anyone could react, he moved. His hand didn't reach for a weapon. It reached for a device clipped to his belt, and Emily's training screamed a single word through her mind, half a second before he pressed it. Detonator. Down, Emily shouted, throwing herself sideways, dragging Torres with her, as the ground beneath the transport vehicles erupted in a violent explosion that sent fire and metal tearing through the compound, the concussive force slamming into her body even from a distance, throwing her hard against frozen earth. For a moment, the world was nothing but ringing silence and the acrid smell of smoke. And when Emily's vision cleared enough to make sense of her surroundings again, the man who had claimed to have orchestrated tonight's entire nightmare was gone, vanished into the chaos and smoke, leaving behind only the smoldering wreckage of the vehicles they had desperately needed to save a dying soldier's life. Is everyone alive? Mitchell's voice cut through the ringing in Emily's ears, strained but functional. Here. Torres coughed, pulling himself upright, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Here. Whitman answered, favoring one arm but otherwise steady. Emily forced herself upright despite the pain radiating through her already battered ribs, scanning the burning wreckage where their only hope of transport had been reduced to twisted smoking metal. Vehicles are gone, she said grimly. We just lost our extraction option. And we just lost the only lead on who's actually running this operation. Mitchell added, his voice tight with frustration and dawning horror at the scope of what they had just learned. Emily, if what he said is true, if this entire ambush was built specifically to draw you out, then it's not over, Emily finished for him, her mind already racing through the terrifying implications. He said the real operation begins now. That means whatever's coming next, it's not going to look anything like what we've already survived tonight. A distant sound cut through the night, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, a mechanical rhythm that every soldier present recognized instantly, and that sent ice through Emily's veins despite everything she had already endured. Rotors. That's not our extraction, Mitchell said slowly, his eyes scanning the darkening sky. Weather's still grounding our birds. Emily's stomach dropped as the sound grew louder, closer, unmistakably approaching from the direction the mysterious commander had disappeared into only moments earlier. Then whose helicopter is that? She asked, though some cold, certain part of her had already begun to suspect the answer, an answer that would confirm the man's chilling promise that tonight's violence had barely even begun. Behind them, back at the SEAL position, the wounded operator's pulse continued to fade with every passing second, a dying man's life ticking away in the darkness, while a new and unknown threat descended from the sky above a valley that had already claimed more blood than any of them had expected to spill on what was supposed to have been a simple, straightforward rescue mission on a quiet, frozen Christmas Eve. The rotor blades grew louder with every passing second, and Emily's mind raced through every possibility, every scenario that could explain an aircraft flying in weather that had supposedly grounded all of your air support for 90 minutes. Nothing about it made sense unless someone had access to equipment far beyond what a militia group should have possessed. "Get to cover now," Emily shouted, already pulling Torres toward the tree line at the edge of the burning compound. Mitchell and Whitman scrambled behind a low stone wall as the sound of rotors intensified, and moments later a sleek black helicopter emerged from the low cloud cover. Running without lights, moving with the kind of precision that spoke of expensive equipment and professional pilots, rather than the improvised militia forces they had been fighting all night. "That's not local," Mitchell said grimly, watching the aircraft bank low over the valley. "Emily, that's a private contractor bird. That kind of equipment costs millions." Emily's jaw tightened as she tracked the helicopter's movement through the darkness, which means whoever built tonight's ambush has resources way beyond a mountain militia. "Ryan, this just went from a rescue mission to something much bigger." The helicopter didn't fire on their position. Instead, it circled once-twice searchlight, sweeping across the smoldering compound as if searching for something specific. And then without warning, it turned and disappeared back into the low clouds, the sound of its rotors fading into the distance as quickly as it had arrived. "They're not here to finish the fight," Emily said slowly, processing the strange behavior. "They're here to confirm something." "Confirm what?" Emily's stomach twisted with dread as the pieces clicked together in her mind. "That I'm still alive. That I'm still here." She looked at Mitchell, her expression hardening with grim understanding. "He wasn't lying about the test, Ryan. Whatever's coming next, that helicopter was just a scout, making sure their real target hasn't slipped away." A voice crackled urgently over the radio, cutting through the tension. "Command, this is Doc. I need everyone back here immediately. He's crashing hard. I don't think I can hold him much longer." The words hit like a physical blow, and Emily watched Mitchell's face transform instantly from strategic calculation to raw, desperate fear for his soldier's life. "Copy, Doc. We're coming," he said, voice cracking, despite his effort to remain steady. Just hold on a little longer." They moved fast, abandoning any hope of using the now destroyed vehicle, sprinting back through the darkness toward the SEAL position, with Emily taking point, scanning for threats, while her mind continued racing through the terrifying implications of everything the mysterious commander had revealed. They arrived to find the medic hunched over the wounded operator, hands slick with blood, his expression carrying the particular desperation of a man watching someone slip away despite everything he was doing to prevent it. "Talk to me," Mitchell said, dropping to his knees beside a soldier. "He's lost too much blood," the medic said, voice tight and clinical, fighting to keep panic from overwhelming his training. "I've done everything I can with what we have. Without a hospital, without a transfusion, he doesn't have much time left." Emily looked down at the young soldier, his face pale as the snow surrounding him, his breathing shallow and labored. She thought of Michael again, of the helplessness she had felt watching a man she cared about slip away, and something inside her hardened with fierce, absolute determination. "There has to be another way to get him out," she said, though even as she spoke, the isolation of their position pressed down on her with crushing weight. Miles from any road. No functioning vehicles. Air support grounded by weather that showed no signs of clearing. A wounded man with minutes, not hours remaining. "Command, this is Overwatch," Emily said into her radio, refusing to accept the situation as hopeless. "I need an update on weather conditions and any possible extraction options, no matter how unconventional." There was a pause before a new voice answered, one belonging to the operations center, coordinating tonight's mission from a location Emily had never seen but had spoken to throughout the night. "Overwatch weather remains grounded for standard rotary assets. However, we do have one option that hasn't been utilized yet. I'm listening. There's a fixed-wing medevac aircraft capable of operating in these conditions, but it requires a suitable landing strip, and the nearest one is currently 12 miles from your position. 12 miles. Through mountainous terrain in the dark, with enemy forces still potentially active in the area, carrying a critically wounded man who might not survive even a fraction of that distance without proper medical support. That's too far, Mitchell said, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible math. He won't survive 12 miles. Emily's mind raced, searching for alternatives, refusing to accept defeat when a man's life hung in the balance. Her eyes fell on the wreckage of the destroyed vehicles, and then further beyond something she hadn't noticed in the chaos of the earlier fighting, a smaller structure at the edge of the compound, partially concealed by rock formations, with markings that suggested storage rather than living quarters. "Ryan, what's in that building?" she asked, pointing toward the structure. "We haven't cleared it yet." "Then we need to. Now." Emily was already moving, driven by an instinct she couldn't fully explain, the same instinct that had warned her about the ambush hours earlier, the same instinct that had never once failed her when it mattered most. They approached the structure carefully, weapons raised, and Emily kicked the door open, sweeping the interior with practiced efficiency. What she found inside made her breath catch with sudden, desperate hope. A motorcycle, old, weathered, clearly used for transport across terrain, too rough for standard vehicles, but functional, with a fuel gauge showing nearly half a tank. "It's not much," Emily said, "but it's something. One rider could make it to the landing strip faster than a team moving on foot, and if he's stable enough for the ride—" "It's a risk," Mitchell said, studying the motorcycle with a mixture of hope and hesitation. "The terrain out there is brutal, especially at night." "Everything about tonight has been a risk," Emily answered. "But right now, it's the only option we have that doesn't end with us watching him die in the snow." Mitchell looked at his wounded soldier, then back at Emily, and something passed between them, the same trust that had defined their relationship since the day she first trained him years earlier. "You're the best rider among us," he said. "You know these mountains better than anyone here." Emily's chest tightened. Riding 12 miles alone through hostile, unfamiliar terrain, carrying a critically wounded man on the back of an aging motorcycle, was almost certainly a suicide mission disguised as a rescue attempt. But the alternative was watching a young soldier die slowly in the snow while they waited for a miracle that wasn't coming. "I'll do it, she said without hesitation. The medic worked quickly, stabilizing the wounded operator as much as possible, securing him to Emily with straps improvised from equipment scattered around the compound. Every movement caused the young soldier to groan in pain, his eyes fluttering open, briefly unfocused and glassy. "Stay with me," Emily said quietly, meeting at his unfocused gaze. "You hear me? You're going to make it home for Christmas. I'm not letting you become another name on a list I already carry too many of." The soldier's lips moved, though no sound emerged, and Emily chose to interpret it as understanding, as a promise between two strangers bound together by the desperate circumstances of a night neither of them had expected to survive. "Overwatch, once you clear the ridge, follow the service road east," the operations center advised through her earpiece. "It's the most direct route, though it's not maintained for winter conditions." "Copy," Emily said, mounting the motorcycle, feeling the wounded soldier's weight settle against her back, his labored breathing audible even over the sound of the engine roaring to life. "Emily," Mitchell's voice carried a weight that went beyond simple mission coordination. "Be careful. We already almost lost you once tonight." "I'll be fine," she said, though both of them understood the uncertainty behind those words. "Hold this position. Keep everyone alive until I can send help back." She accelerated into the darkness, the motorcycle's engine straining against terrain that had never been designed for vehicles. Every bump and obstacle sending jolts of pain through her already battered body, and more terrifyingly through the critically wounded man strapped against her back. "Stay with me," she said repeatedly, partly for his benefit, partly to anchor her own focus against the overwhelming fear clawing at the edges of her concentration. "Almost there, just hold on." The service road proved even more treacherous than she had feared, narrow and icy, winding along the edge of steep drops that offered no margin for error. Twice the rear wheel slid dangerously close to the edge, and twice Emily's years of training and raw determination pulled the motorcycle back from disaster through sheer force of will. Behind her, the wounded soldier's breathing grew increasingly shallow, and Emily felt a fresh wave of desperate urgency propel her forward faster than caution should have allowed. "Command, this is Overwatch." What's my ETA? To the landing strip, she called into her radio voice strained against the wind tearing past her. 6 miles remaining overwatch. Medevac aircraft is inbound and should arrive shortly after you do, weather permitting. 6 miles. It felt like an impossible distance every second, stretching into an eternity of fear and desperate hope. Then without warning, headlights appeared ahead on the narrow road, two vehicles moving fast directly toward her position. Emily's blood ran cold. Whoever these vehicles belonged to, they weren't friendly. No American or Allied forces would be operating unannounced on this isolated mountain road in the middle of the night. Command, I have two hostile vehicles blocking my route, she said, already calculating alternatives, though the narrow road offered painfully few options. Overwatch, can you divert? Emily glanced at the terrain surrounding the road. Steep drops on one side, solid rock face on the other, no realistic alternative route available. Negative, I'm boxed in. The vehicles continued approaching, and Emily made a split-second decision that went against every tactical instinct she possessed. She killed the motorcycle's headlight, plunging herself and her wounded passenger into near-total darkness, and cut the engine, coasting silently off the road into a shallow depression, partially concealed by rock and snow. The vehicles roared past moments later, oblivious to how close they had come to whatever confrontation their occupants had been anticipating. Emily exhaled shakily, restarting the motorcycle's engine and pulling back onto the road, more cautious now, more aware that the enemy commander's promise about a larger operation had not been an empty threat. Command, hostiles have passed my position, continuing toward the landing strip, she reported, though the encounter had shaken her more than she wanted to admit even to herself. Behind her, the wounded soldier made a sound weak and pained, and Emily's heart clenched with renewed urgency. I know, she said softly. Almost there, I promise. The final miles passed in a blur of freezing wind, aching muscles, and desperate focus. Emily pushing the aging motorcycle far beyond what its designers had ever intended, driven entirely by the need to save a life. She had sworn only hours earlier she would never risk herself for again. The landing strip finally emerged from the darkness ahead, marked by faint emergency lighting that felt in that moment like the most beautiful sight Emily had ever witnessed. A small fixed-wing aircraft sat waiting, engine already running, ground crew standing ready to receive the wounded soldier the moment Emily brought him within reach. Command, Overwatch has arrived at the landing strip, she said, relief flooding through her exhausted body as she brought the motorcycle to a stop. Medical personnel rushed forward immediately, carefully removing the wounded operator from where he had been strapped against Emily's back, their trained hands moving with the swift efficiency of people who understood exactly how little time remained. Pulse is weak, but present, one of them called out. Get him aboard now. Emily watched them carry the young soldier toward the waiting aircraft, and for a moment, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her completely. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the last hour finally beginning to fade, leaving raw pain and bone-deep fatigue in its place. Captain Carter, one of the medical personnel, called back to her as they prepared to close the aircraft's door. He's got a fighting chance because of you. Whatever you did to get him here, it worked. Emily nodded, unable to find words adequate to the moment, watching as the aircraft's engines roared louder, preparing for takeoff despite weather conditions that would have grounded almost any other flight. As the aircraft lifted into the darkness, carrying a young soldier toward a hospital, in a future he might not have had without Emily's desperate, dangerous ride through hostile mountain terrain, her radio crackled back to life. Overwatch, this is Command. Excellent work. But we have a problem back at your team's position. Emily's relief evaporated instantly, replaced by cold, immediate dread. What kind of problem? We're picking up increased enemy movement, converging on Commander Mitchell's location. Multiple vehicles, significantly larger force than what you encountered earlier tonight. Emily's chest tightened painfully. How much larger? There was a pause, brief but heavy with implication. Our estimates suggest at least 50 additional hostiles, possibly more, along with what appears to be organized command and control elements. 50 additional fighters against a team of 4 exhausted, wounded operators who had already survived one impossible battle tonight and now faced an even larger force with dwindling ammunition and no immediate hope of reinforcement. That's the second wave, Emily said, her mind racing back to the mysterious commander's chilling words. The real operation begins the moment you believe this fight is over. Command, I need transport back Commander Mitchell's position immediately. Overwatch, the motorcycle you used to reach the landing strip is critically low on fuel, and reinforcements from our side remain grounded by weather. We don't have a way to get you back there quickly. Emily's mind raced through every possible option, refusing to accept that she had just saved one soldier's life, only to lose the remaining four to overwhelming enemy numbers, while she stood helpless 12 miles away. Then find me something, she said, her voice hardening with absolute determination. Because I am not losing anyone else tonight. A ground crew member who had helped load the wounded soldiers stepped forward hesitantly. Ma'am, we have a supply vehicle here, older model, but it should handle that terrain better than a motorcycle. It's not much, but it's something. Emily didn't hesitate. Get it running, now. Within minutes, she was speeding back along the treacherous mountain road, this time in a rugged supply truck that offered more stability than the motorcycle, but still struggled against the unforgiving terrain. Her mind raced through tactical possibilities, calculating how she could possibly help a team of 4 survive an assault from 50 or more enemy fighters when she herself was still miles away. Command patch me through to Commander Mitchell directly, she said, urgency sharpening every word. Standing by. Ryan, this is Emily. Do you copy? Static crackled for a tense moment before Mitchell's voice broke through tight with the particular controlled fear of a man watching an overwhelming force approach his position. Emily, thank God. We're seeing serious enemy movement. This is way bigger than what we fought before. I know Command already briefed me. I'm on my way back, but it's going to take time I don't think you have. How much time do you need? Emily glanced at the terrain ahead, calculating distance against the truck's maximum safe speed on this treacherous road. 15 minutes, maybe 20 if the road conditions worsen. Emily, Mitchell's voice carried a weight that made her chest ache. We might not have 15 minutes. This force is organized, moving with purpose, definitely not the disorganized militia fighters we dealt with earlier. If this is what that commander meant by the real operation we're looking at, something we can't survive with 4 operators and limited ammunition. Emily's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her mind racing through every possible solution, refusing to accept that after everything they had already survived tonight, this was how the story would end. Listen to me, Ryan, she said, forcing steel into her voice, despite the fear clawing at her chest. You get your team to the highest, most defensible position available. Use whatever terrain advantage you can find. I am coming and I am not stopping for anything. Copy that, Mitchell said, though Emily could hear the underlying acceptance in his voice, the quiet resignation of a commander preparing his team for what might be their final stand. The truck's engine roared as Emily pushed it harder, faster, ignoring the protests of overworked machinery, straining against terrain it was never designed to handle at this speed. Behind her, the sound of the medevac aircraft had long since faded into silence, replaced now by the growing certainty that she was racing against time itself to reach 4 men who might not survive long enough for her to make a difference. Her radio crackled again, this time carrying a note of genuine alarm that sent fresh ice through her veins. Overwatch were picking up enemy communications indicating multiple assault elements are already in position around Commander Mitchell's location, the operations center reported. Contact could begin at any moment. Emily's foot pressed harder against the accelerator, the truck's engine screaming in protest as she pushed it beyond every reasonable safety limit. Racing through darkness toward a battle she wasn't sure she would reach in time to matter toward 4 exhausted soldiers who had already given everything they had tonight and now faced an enemy force that dwarfed everything they had already survived. Somewhere behind the growing static of enemy radio chatter and the roar of her own straining engine, Emily thought she heard the first distant crack of gunfire, faint but unmistakable, echoing across miles of frozen mountain terrain, signaling that the second wave of tonight's nightmare had already begun without her leaving Commander Ryan Mitchell and his 3 remaining operators to face an overwhelming enemy force completely alone. The gunfire grew louder with every mile, and Emily gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles went white beneath her gloves, the truck bouncing violently over frozen ruts as she pushed it far past any speed the vehicle was ever designed to handle. Ryan, talk to me, she shouted into her radio static, crackling in response before his voice finally broke through, strained and breathless. They're pushing from the north and east simultaneously. We're pinned down behind what's left of the compound wall. But Emily, there's too many of them. We can't hold much longer. How many can you see? I stopped counting past 30. Whitman took a graze to the shoulder. Torres is down to his last magazine. I'm not much better off. A burst of gunfire nearly swallowed his next words. We need a miracle. Emily's jaw clenched as she rounded a final bend in the road, and the compound came into view below, her muzzle flashes lighting the darkness in a chaotic rhythm that told her exactly how desperate things had already become. "I'm 2 minutes out," she said. "Hold that position." "Do you hear me? Hold it." "Copy," Mitchell answered, though the exhaustion in his voice carried an unspoken truth neither of them wanted to say out loud. 2 minutes might already be too long. Emily brought the truck skidding to a stop at the edge of the compound, grabbing her rifle and throwing herself out of the cab before the vehicle had even fully settled, sprinting low across open ground toward the sound of gunfire and the men she had sworn not to lose tonight. She found Mitchell pressed against a crumbling stone wall, blood streaking one side of his face from a shrapnel wound, his weapon raised and firing in short controlled bursts that betrayed just how low his ammunition had fallen. Torres crouched beside him, reloading with trembling hands, while Whitman lay propped against the wall, one arm hanging useless, still managing to provide covering fire with the other. "You made it," Mitchell said, relief and disbelief tangled together in his voice as Emily dropped into cover beside him. "Told you I would." Emily immediately began scanning the battlefield, cataloging enemy positions with the same brutal efficiency that had defined every moment of this endless, impossible night. What she saw made her chest tighten with a fear she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. This wasn't a militia force anymore. The fighters advancing toward their position moved with disciplined, coordinated precision, using cover intelligently communicating through hand signals that spoke of real military training rather than improvised local defense. And behind them, directing their movement from a position of relative safety, stood a figure Emily recognized immediately, the same gray-haired commander who had detonated the vehicles and vanished into the night less than an hour earlier. "He's here," Emily said grimly. "He's personally overseeing this." "Then he's about to regret it," Mitchell said through gritted teeth, firing another controlled burst that dropped an advancing fighter. But even as he spoke, Emily could see the mathematics of this fight, and the mathematics were brutal. 4 exhausted, wounded defenders against a force that outnumbered them more than 10-1, with ammunition running critically low, and no realistic hope of reinforcement arriving before this battle reached its conclusion, one way or another. "Command, this is Overwatch," Emily said into her radio voice tight with controlled urgency. "We are critically outnumbered and nearly out of ammunition. I need every available asset moving toward our position immediately. Overwatch weather has cleared enough for limited air support." The operations center responded, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Emily heard something in their voice that resembled genuine hope. "We have a gunship inbound ETA 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Emily looked at the advancing enemy line easily 200 meters closer than they had been 30 seconds ago, closing the distance with the confident, unhurried pace of a force that believed victory was already assured. "We don't have 8 minutes, she said quietly, mostly to herself. "Then we make 8 minutes, Mitchell answered, having heard her despite the chaos surrounding them. He turned to his exhausted team, his voice hardening with the particular resolve of a leader, refusing to let his soldiers see the fear consuming him from the inside. "Listen up. We hold this position. We make every round count. Nobody dies tonight. Is that understood?" "Understood," Torres and Whitman answered in ragged unison, and something in their voices, despite the exhaustion and pain evident in every word, carried a fierce determination that mirrored their commander's own. Emily settled into position beside them, rifle raised, mind already calculating angles and priorities with the cold, mechanical precision that had defined every moment of tonight's impossible battle. "I'll take their flanks," she said. "Ryan, keep their center suppressed. We funnel them into a kill zone and make them pay for every meter." "Copy that." The enemy advance intensified gunfire tearing into the crumbling wall that offered their only real protection, chips of stone exploding around them with every passing second. Emily fired methodically, dropping fighters attempting to flank their position from the west, but for every one she eliminated, 2 more seemed to emerge from the darkness beyond an endless tide that showed no signs of weakening despite the mounting casualties. "Emily, ammunition check," Mitchell called out, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. 12 rounds, Emily answered, feeling the weight of that number settle heavily in her chest. 12 rounds against dozens of advancing fighters with no realistic hope of resupply before either the gunship arrived or their position was completely overrun. "Same situation over here," Torres said grimly, checking his own dwindling supply. Whitman said nothing, his silence more concerning than any words could have been, his good arm shaking now from exhaustion and blood loss, that had clearly progressed further than he had been willing to admit. "Command status on that gunship," Emily demanded, watching the enemy line continue its relentless, methodical advance. 6 minutes out Overwatch. 6 minutes. An eternity measured against 12 rounds in a wall that was slowly being reduced to rubble beneath sustained enemy fire. Emily's mind raced, searching desperately for any tactical advantage that could buy her team the time they needed to survive. Her eyes fell on a small structure at the edge of the compound, partially collapsed from earlier fighting, but positioned in a way that could potentially offer a choke point, a narrow passage that would force the enemy's numerical advantage to matter far less. "Ryan, if we fall back to that structure, we force them through a single approach," she said, already calculating the geometry of survival. "It won't stop them, but it'll slow them down enough to matter." Mitchell glanced at the structure, then at his exhausted, wounded team, weighing the risk of movement under fire against the certainty of being overrun where they currently stood. "It's our best option," he said finally. "On my mark, we move. Emily, your rear guard." "Copy." The enemy advance surged forward with renewed intensity, clearly sensing weakness in the defender's position, and Emily understood instantly that they had perhaps 30 seconds before any retreat became impossible. "Now!" Mitchell shouted, and the team broke from cover, simultaneously moving in a tight, disciplined formation toward the partially collapsed structure, while Emily covered their retreat, firing precise, economical shots that dropped the closest pursuing fighters without wasting a single round she couldn't afford to lose. They reached the structure just as enemy fire intensified, bullets tearing into the stone around the narrow entrance as Emily backed inside, last sealing off what little protection the collapsed walls could offer. "This buys us time," Mitchell said, breathing hard, "but not much. They'll figure out the choke point within minutes." "Then we make those minutes count," Emily answered, already positioning herself to cover the narrow entrance, the only approach the enemy could realistically use without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire. The first fighters who attempted to breach the choke point fell instantly, Emily's remaining rounds finding their marks with brutal efficiency, but even she understood this couldn't last forever. Eventually, ammunition would run out entirely, and no amount of tactical positioning could save 4 people against dozens once the fighting became close quarters and desperate. "Command gunship status," she demanded, her voice fraying at the edges despite every effort to maintain control. 4 minutes Overwatch." 4 minutes. Emily glanced down at her rifle, calculating the rounds remaining, calculating the fighters still advancing, calculating the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of a battle that was rapidly approaching its breaking point. "Ryan," she said quietly, "if this doesn't work, it's going to work." Mitchell cut her off, his voice fierce with a determination that refused to accept any other outcome. "We didn't survive everything tonight just to lose it here. Do you understand me? We are getting out of this." Emily nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her resolve, the same doubt that had haunted her for 3 years. The fear that no matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she gave, sometimes the mathematics of war simply didn't care about good intentions or desperate courage. Outside, the enemy commander's voice carried across the compound, amplified by some kind of portable speaker system, speaking directly to them in clear, confident English that carried an unmistakable edge of triumph. "Captain Carter," the voice called out, "you fought well tonight, better than I expected. But surely you understand this ends only one way." Emily's jaw tightened, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response, though her mind raced with fury at the calculated cruelty of a man who had orchestrated an entire night of violence purely to settle a personal vendetta rooted in grief neither side had ever fully processed. "Your soldiers can still walk away from this," the voice continued. "Surrender yourself and I will let them go. This has always been about you, Captain, not them." Mitchell's eyes locked onto Emily's, something fierce and protective burning behind his exhausted expression. "Don't you dare consider that," he said quietly, though the words carried the weight of an order rather than a suggestion. "I wasn't going to," Emily answered, though something in her chest ached at the offer, at the terrible temptation of ending 3 years of accumulated guilt with a single final sacrifice that might finally balance the scales she had been carrying since Syria. But sacrifice wasn't the answer. She had learned that lesson tonight, learned it in the desperate ride across 12 miles of hostile terrain to save a dying soldier, learned it in every moment she had chosen to fight rather than surrender to the guilt that had defined her for far too long. "Command gunship ETA," she demanded again. watching the enemy line begin regrouping for what was clearly about to become a final overwhelming assault on their position. 3 minutes Overwatch, they're pushing hard. 3 minutes felt like an impossible distance, and Emily could see in the enemy's renewed positioning that they didn't intend to wait that long gathering for what was obviously going to be a coordinated final push designed to overwhelm the choke point through sheer numbers and volume of fire. "They're massing for an assault," she reported grimly. "This is it. This is their final push before that gunship arrives." Mitchell's expression hardened. "Then we make sure it's the most expensive assault they've ever attempted." The enemy surge began seconds later, dozens of fighters converging in on the narrow entrance. Simultaneously, their gunfire so intense that Emily and her team could barely return effective fire without exposing themselves to near certain death. Stone chips exploded around them. The structure itself groaned under the sustained assault, threatening to collapse entirely under the weight of concentrated firepower. "Ammunition critical?" Torres shouted, his voice cracking with the particular desperation of a soldier realizing his weapon was about to fall silent at the worst possible moment. "Same here." Whitman called out, his voice weaker, now blood loss clearly taking its toll, despite his refusal to stop fighting. Emily fired her last 3 rounds in rapid succession, each one finding a target. But even as the fighters dropped more, surged forward to take their place, an endless wave that seemed determined to simply overwhelm them through sheer attrition, regardless of casualties. "I'm out." She said the words heavy with implications neither of them wanted to voice aloud. Mitchell's own weapon clicked empty a moment later, and in that terrible silence, broken only by the enemy's continued advance, and shouted commands from their commander, Emily understood they had reached the absolute limit of what tactical skill and desperate courage could accomplish. "Command," she said into her radio voice, steady despite the situation collapsing around her. "We are completely out of ammunition. Enemy forces are breaching our position. If that gunship doesn't arrive in the next 60 seconds, this fight is over." There was a pause, brief but agonizing, before the operations center responded. "Overwatch gunship is 30 seconds out. They have you on visual hold on just a little longer." 30 seconds. Emily looked at Mitchell, at Torres, at Whitman, at the narrow entrance where enemy fighters were already beginning to push through, weapons raised, victory clearly within their grasp, after everything this small, exhausted team had already survived tonight. "On your feet," Emily said suddenly, an idea forming with a desperate clarity that only came in the final seconds before everything ended one way or another. "We fight with what we have left." She grabbed a fallen piece of broken stone heavy enough to serve as a weapon in the absolute worst-case scenario, and positioned herself directly in the narrow entrance, prepared to meet the enemy, advance with nothing more than raw physical determination, if that was what tonight ultimately demanded of her. The first fighter breached the entrance, weapon raised, and Emily moved before conscious thought could slow her down, driving the stone into his weapon arm with enough force to send his rifle clattering away before Mitchell's fist finished what her strike had started. A second fighter followed immediately, and this time Torres met him, wrestling the weapon away in a desperate close-quarters struggle that ended only when Whitman, despite his wounded arm, managed to drive his boot into the man's knee hard enough to end the confrontation. But more fighters were coming, an endless tide, pressing against their impossibly thin defense, and Emily understood with brutal clarity that raw courage alone couldn't hold back numbers this overwhelming forever. Then the sound reached them, distant at first, then growing with terrifying speed, a deep, powerful rhythm that Emily recognized instantly from years of combat experience. Rotor blades, multiple engines, the unmistakable signature of a proper military gunship, not the sleek, silent aircraft that had scouted their position earlier, but something far more powerful, far more devastating. "That's ours," Mitchell shouted, hope flooding into his exhausted voice. The enemy fighters pressing against their position seemed to hear it too, their advance faltering as the sound grew louder, closer, more unmistakably threatening with every passing second. Then the night sky lit up with devastating, overwhelming force as the gunship arrived directly above the compound, its weapon systems opening fire on the enemy positions with a precision and power that turned the tide of battle in seconds rather than minutes. Emily watched through the narrow entrance as the enemy formation that had seemed so utterly overwhelming moments earlier scattered in complete disarray, fighters abandoning their positions, entirely fleeing into the darkness rather than face the devastating firepower now raining down from above. Command, this is Overwatch, Emily said, relief flooding through her exhausted body with an intensity that nearly buckled her knees. Gunship is on station. Enemy forces are retreating. Copy that, Overwatch. Excellent work tonight. Ground forces are inbound to secure your position and begin extraction. Mitchell slumped against the wall, adrenaline finally beginning to fade, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion and the particular disbelief of a man who had genuinely believed only minutes earlier that tonight might be his last. We made it, he said quietly, almost as if he needed to say the words aloud to fully believe them. We made it, Emily confirmed, though her eyes remained fixed on the chaos outside, searching for any sign of the gray-haired commander who had orchestrated this entire nightmare, refusing to fully accept victory until she confirmed the man responsible for tonight's violence had either been captured or eliminated. She found him moments later attempting to flee toward the tree line at the edge of the compound, moving with the desperate urgency of a man who understood his elaborate plan had ultimately failed. Emily grabbed a discarded weapon from one of the fallen fighters near the entrance, checking the magazine with practiced efficiency before moving to intercept him. Emily, wait, Mitchell called after her, though exhaustion and injury prevented him from immediately following. She caught up to the commander at the edge of the tree line, weapon raised, her voice carrying across the distance between them with absolute unwavering authority. Stop. The man froze, slowly turning to face her, and for a moment, something like genuine respect flickered across his exhausted features. You survived, he said almost to himself. Even this you survived. Your operation is over, Emily said, weapon steady despite the exhaustion radiating through every muscle in her body. Get on your knee. The man's eyes studied her, carefully weighing options that had clearly narrowed to almost nothing. You could kill me right now, he said quietly. After everything I orchestrated tonight, after everything you learned about my brother, about the connection between us, you would be justified. Emily's finger remained steady against the trigger guard, and for a long, terrible moment, the temptation whispered through her mind, the same dark voice that had haunted her for 3 years. The voice that insisted violence could somehow balance the scales of grief and guilt that both of them carried. But that voice had lied to her for 3 years, convincing her that punishment and self-destruction were the only appropriate response to tragedy she never intended to cause. She had learned tonight in the desperate ride across 12 miles of hostile terrain, in the impossible last stand against overwhelming numbers, that redemption came not through vengeance, but through the courage to keep fighting for the living, regardless of what the dead demanded. Get on your knees, Emily repeated, her voice hardening with absolute resolve. You're going to answer for what you did tonight, not through my bullet, but through justice, the same justice that failed to properly explain what happened to your brother, and that I am not going to circumvent by becoming exactly what tonight's violence tried to turn me into. The man studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his exhausted eyes, and finally, slowly, he lowered himself to his knees, the fight completely drained from his posture. Ground forces arrived minutes later, securing the compound and taking the commander into custody, while medical personnel began treating Mitchell, Torres, and Whitman for their injuries with the swift efficiency of professionals who had clearly seen far too many nights exactly like this one. Emily stood apart from the immediate chaos of the aftermath, watching as her 3 surviving teammates received treatment, watching as the compound that had nearly become their graveyard was systematically secured and cleared, feeling the full weight of tonight's violence finally settling into her exhausted body now that the immediate danger had passed. Captain Carter. A medic approached her carefully, noting the blood still trickling from the cut above her eyebrow, the bruising visible along her ribs, the general exhaustion evident in every line of her posture. You need medical attention too. I'm fine, Emily said automatically, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Mitchell, despite his own injuries, made his way over to her, moving slowly but with the determined focus of a man who had something important to say. Emily, he said quietly, you saved all of us tonight, not just once. 3 separate times you made choices that kept this team alive when every reasonable calculation suggested we should have died. Emily looked away, uncomfortable with the weight of his gratitude, the way it pressed against 3 years of carefully constructed guilt that insisted she didn't deserve credit for saving lives when she still carried the burden of one she had failed to save. I almost didn't come, she admitted quietly. If you hadn't asked directly, if you hadn't shown me that photograph of Sarah, I would have stayed away. I would have let my guilt keep me hidden forever. But you didn't, Mitchell said firmly. You came. You fought. You saved 7 American soldiers, 3 hostages, and probably prevented whatever larger operation that commander was planning beyond tonight. Emily, that's not something guilt should diminish. That's something worth being proud of. Emily's eyes drifted toward the horizon where the first faint hints of dawn were beginning to soften the darkness that had defined this endless, violent night. Somewhere beyond these mountains, Sarah and her parents were being reunited with people who loved them, unaware of exactly how close tonight had come to ending in tragedy instead of rescue. Somewhere in a hospital, a young soldier was fighting for his life with a chance he wouldn't have had without Emily's desperate ride through hostile terrain. And somewhere in her own heart, buried beneath 3 years of guilt and self-imposed exile, something had finally begun to shift, a recognition that perhaps redemption didn't require perfect atonement, that perhaps saving lives moving forward could exist alongside grief for the life she couldn't save in the past, rather than being canceled out by it entirely. Michael would have been proud of you tonight, Mitchell said quietly, watching her carefully. I know that doesn't erase what happened in Syria. I know it doesn't fix 3 years of guilt in one night, but I think he would have wanted you to know that. Emily's throat tightened, emotion finally breaking through the careful control she had maintained throughout tonight's relentless violence. I miss him every day, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't think that's ever going to change. It shouldn't change, Mitchell said gently, but maybe it doesn't have to mean you stop living either. Maybe honoring him means continuing to do what you were trained to do, protecting people who need protecting, rather than punishing yourself into permanent silence. Weeks later, in a formal ceremony conducted with quiet dignity, befitting the seriousness of what had transpired that Christmas Eve, Emily Carter stood before military leadership as they recognized her extraordinary actions with the Silver Star, one of the highest honors available for combat valor. Commander Mitchell stood beside her, along with Torres and Whitman, both fully recovered from their injuries, and even the young soldier, whose life Emily had saved through her desperate motorcycle ride, walking with a cane, but very much alive, very much present, to witness the recognition of the woman who had refused to let him become another tragic statistic. But for Emily, the medal itself mattered far less than what the ceremony represented. It wasn't recognition for a single night of heroism. It was acknowledgement that she had finally found a way to carry both grief and purpose simultaneously, that Shadow Viper and Emily Carter weren't two separate identities locked in conflict, but a single woman who had learned through fire and blood and impossible choices that courage wasn't the absence of fear or guilt, but the willingness to act despite carrying both. Sometime after the ceremony concluded, Emily made a journey she had avoided for 3 long years, standing quietly in a peaceful cemetery where Sergeant Michael Reynolds had been laid to rest, snow gently falling around her, the same way it had fallen on that impossible Christmas Eve that had finally broken through 3 years of self-imposed exile. I kept fighting, she said softly, the words she had been unable to speak for 3 years, finally finding their way past the guilt that had silenced them for so long. I know I couldn't save you. I know that's never going to stop hurting. But I promise you, Michael, I'm not going to let that guilt keep me from saving the people I still can. The wind moved gently through the cemetery, carrying with it a peace Emily hadn't allowed herself to feel in 3 long years, a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps this was what true redemption actually looked like. Not the erasure of past mistakes, not the impossible pursuit of perfect atonement, but the courage to keep moving forward, carrying love and loss together, choosing every single day to fight for the living, rather than remain forever trapped by grief for those already gone. 7 American soldiers made it home for Christmas because one wounded, guilt-stricken woman refused to stay hidden on a mountainside when lives depended on her courage. 3 innocent hostages returned safely to families who had feared the worst. A dangerous, calculated enemy commander who had orchestrated an elaborate plan built on his own grief and vengeance was brought to justice rather than becoming another casualty in an endless cycle of violence and retaliation. And somewhere in those frozen mountains, the legend of Shadow Viper transformed permanently from a story of failure and tragedy into something far more powerful, proof that even the deepest wounds don't have to define a person forever. That courage sometimes means climbing back into the fight you swore you'd never enter again. And that the truest heroes aren't the ones who never fall, but the ones who find the strength to rise again when everything and everyone tells them it's impossible. Emily Carter had spent 3 years believing one terrible night in Syria had permanently broken something inside her that could never be repaired. But on a frozen mountainside in Afghanistan, on a Christmas Eve that should have ended in tragedy, but instead became a testament to unbreakable resilience. She discovered the truth that had been waiting for her all along. She wasn't broken. She was simply waiting for a reason powerful enough to remind her who she had always been, underneath all that guilt and grief and self-imposed exile. She was and would always remain exactly the kind of soldier this world desperately needed, someone who understood that true strength isn't measured by the absence of pain, but by the unwavering choice to keep fighting for others, no matter how much the fight costs, no matter how many ghosts follow you into battle. And that Christmas Eve, against every impossible odds stacked against her, Emily Carter proved beyond any doubt that heroes are not born without scars. They are forged by them, tempered by loss, and ultimately defined not by the battles that broke them, but by their unshakable choice to rise, fight, and save others again and again for as long as they possibly can.